The big rig rumbled through the night, its headlights cutting through the thick darkness like a knife. The road stretched out endlessly before it, a ribbon of asphalt disappearing into the void. The hum of the engine was a constant companion, a steady rhythm that matched the beating of Tom's heart. Tom gripped the steering wheel with a firm hand, his knuckles white from the pressure. He scanned the road ahead, his eyes darting from side to side, ever vigilant. The road was empty, a desolate stretch of highway that seemed to go on forever. He was used to these lonely nights, the solitude of the open road. Blackness pressed in on all sides, the dense forest on either side of the road creating an impenetrable wall of darkness. The Appalachians loomed in the distance, their dark shapes barely visible against the night sky. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, a reminder of the wilderness that surrounded him. The mountains were dark shapes against the night sky, their peaks shrouded in shadow. The air was still, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a night bird. It was a peaceful, almost eerie silence, a stark contrast to the noise and chaos of the city. The smell of pine and damp earth was heavy in the air, a constant reminder of the forest that surrounded him. Tom was alone, the only human for miles around. He hadn't seen another vehicle for hours, the road ahead and behind him empty and desolate. He hadn't seen another vehicle for hours. The road was his alone, a lonely stretch of asphalt that seemed to go on forever. It was just him and the whispering highway, the hum of his engine, the only sound in the still night. The highway whispered to him, the sound of the tires on the asphalt, a soothing, almost hypnotic rhythm. The silence was broken only by the hum of his engine, a constant, reassuring presence in the darkness. He reached for his thermos, the familiar weight of it comforting in his hand. The silence was broken only by the hum of his engine. He reached for his thermos. The coffee was cold. Tom didn't mind. The caffeine helped keep him awake, the bitter taste a welcome distraction from the monotony of the road. He reached for his thermos. The coffee was cold. Tom didn't mind. The caffeine helped keep him awake. He took a sip, the cold liquid a shock to his system. It was a small comfort, a reminder that he was still alive, still moving forward. The caffeine helped keep him awake. He had miles to go before sunrise, the road stretching out endlessly before him. The night was his domain, the darkness a familiar companion. He was alone, but he was not lonely. The road was his home, the truck his sanctuary. He had miles to go before sunrise. The first light of dawn was still hours away, the sky a deep, inky black. But Tom didn't mind. He was used to the darkness, the solitude of the open road. It was a lonely road, a lonely night, but it was his road, his night, and that was enough. The CB radio crackled. Tom nearly dropped his thermos. It was a woman's voice. She sounded desperate. "Help me," she whispered. Her words were choked with fear. "Please, he's coming!" Tom's heart pounded. His hand trembled as he reached for the CB microphone. He had to help. He couldn't ignore a call for help. "This is Big Tom," he said, his voice rough. "Where are you? What's wrong?" Static hissed. Then the woman's voice came back, weaker this time. "Mile marker 207, she breathed. "Please hurry." The transmission ended abruptly. Tom's mind raced. The highway stretched out before him, a ribbon of asphalt disappearing into the twilight. He had been driving for hours, the hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump of the tires on the road his only companions. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to dance and flicker in the periphery of his vision. He was tired, but he couldn't stop now. Not when he was so close. He was close to mile marker 207. The number had been burned into his mind ever since he heard the distress call. It was a lonely stretch of road miles from the nearest town, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to swallow the light. He had passed this way many times before, but tonight it felt different. There was an unease in the air, a tension that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He could be there in 10 minutes, but something felt wrong. The sky above was a deep, bruised purple, heavy with the promise of a storm. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves of the trees that lined the highway. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. Time seemed to be moving slower, each minute stretching out into an eternity. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was driving into something he wasn't prepared for. The woman's voice was filled with terror. Her words echoed in his mind, a desperate plea for help. "He's coming," she had said, her voice trembling with fear. Who was coming? And why was she so afraid? He had tried to ask her more, but the connection had been lost, leaving him with more questions than answers. He had to find her, to make sure she was safe. And what did she mean, he's coming? The phrase played over and over in his mind, a haunting refrain that he couldn't ignore. He had heard many distress calls in his time on the road, but this one was different. There was a raw, primal fear in her voice that chilled him to the bone. He couldn't help but wonder what kind of danger awaited him. At mile marker 207. He glanced at the dark woods lining the highway. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. He imagined danger lurking there, hidden in the shadows, waiting to pounce. His imagination ran wild, conjuring images of all the things that could be hiding in the darkness. He shook his head, trying to clear his mind. He needed to stay focused. He imagined danger lurking there. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. He couldn't help but feel like he was being watched, like there were eyes following his every move. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. He had to keep going. He had to find her. His hand tightened on the steering wheel. The leather was cool and smooth under his fingers, a small comfort in the growing darkness. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He had faced danger before, but this felt different. This felt personal. He couldn't let fear control him. He had a job to do. He had a bad feeling about this. His instincts were screaming at him to turn back, to get as far away from mile marker 207 as possible, but he couldn't ignore her plea. He had to help. It was the right thing to do. He couldn't live with himself if he turned his back on someone in need. He had to see this through, no matter the cost, but he couldn't ignore her plea. He had to help. It was the trucker's code. They looked out for each other, no matter what. He had made a promise to himself when he first started driving that he would always be there for his fellow truckers. And he wasn't about to break that promise now. He had to find her. He had to make sure she was safe. It was the trucker's code, a bond that went beyond words, forged in the long hours and lonely miles on the road. They were a family, bound together by their shared experiences and the understanding that they could always count on each other. He knew that if the roles were reversed, she would do the same for him. He couldn't let her down. He pushed down his fear and pressed the gas pedal. The truck surged forward. The engine roared to life, a powerful reminder of the strength and resilience that had carried him through countless miles. He was determined to reach mile marker 207, to find the woman who had called for help, and to face whatever danger awaited him. He was a trucker, and he would not be deterred. The miles ticked by. Each one felt like 10. Tom kept his eyes glued to the road. He scanned the shadows for any sign of movement. He reached for the CB. "Hello? Can you hear me? I'm approaching mile marker 207. Only static answered him. He gripped the steering wheel tighter. The silence was unnerving. The darkness seemed deeper now. The woods pressed closer to the road. He saw it. Up ahead. A faint light flickered through the trees. It was near mile marker 207. His pulse quickened. He slowed the truck. He grabbed his flashlight. His hand was slick with sweat. He pulled onto the shoulder. The truck's headlights swept across the trees. He saw a dirt road leading into the woods. The light was coming from that direction. Tom took a deep breath. He stepped out of the cab. The air was cold and still. He could hear his own breathing. He walked towards the dirt road. Each step felt heavy. The light grew brighter. He could see the outline of a vehicle. It was a car, pulled off to the side of the road. He approached cautiously. He held the flashlight high. The car was empty. Tom played his flashlight beam around the clearing. There was no sign of the woman, no sign of anyone. "Hello?" he called out. "Is anyone here?" His voice echoed in the stillness. There was no answer. He checked the car. The driver's side door was open. He looked inside. There was a purse on the passenger seat. He didn't touch it. A chill ran down his spine. He turned to leave. That's when he heard it. The CB radio in his truck crackled to life. The woman's voice filled with urgency. "Help me, please," she pleaded. Her voice was closer now, much closer. "He's coming. He's right." The transmission cut out again. Tom spun around. He swung his flashlight beam through the trees. His heart pounded in his chest. He was alone. The woods were silent. The air was thick with an eerie stillness, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig seemed amplified in the quiet, making his heart race faster. He could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on him, a tangible force that made him acutely aware of his solitude. There was no sign of the woman, no sign of anyone. The path ahead was empty. Stretching out into the unknown, he had followed her here, or at least he thought he had, but now, standing in the middle of the forest, he began to doubt his own senses. Had he imagined her? Was his mind playing tricks on him? The more he thought about it, the more uncertain he became. Had she ever been there? The question gnawed at him, and a persistent doubt that refused to be silenced. He replayed the events in his mind, trying to piece together the fragments of his memory. He remembered her voice, soft and urgent, calling out to him. He remembered the way she moved, quick and graceful, leading him deeper into the woods. But now those memories seemed distant and unreal, like a fading dream. Or was this some cruel trick? The thought sent a shiver down his spine. What if he had been lured here on purpose? What if someone was watching him right now, hidden among the trees, waiting for the right moment to strike? He scanned the forest, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow, but he saw nothing. Just the same empty woods, silent and still. He didn't know what to think. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. He had always prided himself on being rational, on being able to think clearly in any situation. But now, standing alone in the forest, he felt lost and helpless. He tried to calm himself, to think logically, but the fear was too strong. It clouded his thoughts, making it impossible to focus. He just knew he had to get out of there. The urge to flee was overwhelming, a primal instinct that he couldn't ignore. He turned and started to run, his feet pounding against the forest floor. The trees blurred past him as he sprinted, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He didn't know where he was going, he just knew he had to get away from this place, from the fear and the uncertainty. He ran back to his truck. It was the only place that felt safe, the only place where he could escape the oppressive silence of the forest. He could see it in the distance, a small beacon of hope in the darkness. He pushed himself harder, his legs burning with the effort, until he finally reached it. He jumped inside and slammed the door. The sound echoed in the stillness, a sharp contrast to the silence outside. He locked the doors, his hands trembling, and took a moment to catch his breath. The interior of the truck felt like a sanctuary, a small bubble of safety in the midst of the unknown. He fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. It took him a few tries to get the key into the ignition, his fingers clumsy with fear. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, a rapid, relentless beat that seemed to echo in his ears. Finally, he managed to start the engine, the sound a welcome relief in the silence. He started the engine and pulled away. He didn't look back. The forest receded into the distance, swallowed by the darkness. He kept his eyes on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He didn't know where he was going, he just knew he had to keep moving, to put as much distance between himself and the forest as possible. He drove through the night, the woman's voice echoing in his mind. Her words were a haunting refrain, a reminder of the mystery he had left behind. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something, that there was a piece of the puzzle he hadn't found. But he was too afraid to go back, too afraid to face whatever might be waiting for him in the forest. He never stopped to help anyone on a deserted road again. The experience had changed him, left a mark that he couldn't erase. He became more cautious, more wary of strangers. The memory of the woman and the fear he had felt in the forest stayed with him, a constant reminder of the unknown dangers that lurked in the world. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had been lured into something sinister, something he couldn't explain. The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that there was something more to the woman's disappearance. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't make sense of it. The mystery remained, an unsolved puzzle that haunted his thoughts. Something he didn't want to understand. The fear and confusion were too much to bear. He preferred to leave the mystery unsolved, to let it fade into the background of his mind. But deep down, he knew that he would